The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $95, and somewhere in the middle of the crowd a man laughed loud enough that the sound carried out past the tent poles and into the yellow October field beyond. It was the kind of laugh that expects company, that reaches for other men's shoulders and pulls them in, and a few of them obliged, the way men in small towns oblige a loud voice out of habit more than agreement. The date was the 12th of October, 1986, and the place was the Halloran Estate Auction, 3 miles east of Beckett's Ford, on the old Dairy Road, where the county had come to pick over what was left of a fire captain's 40-year. The object on the block was a locker. Not a proper cabinet, not a chest, but a tall, narrow, olive-painted steel locker of the kind that used to stand in the back rooms of firehouses before the newer stations went to open lockers and mesh baskets. It had been through smoke. You could see that from 10 feet away. The paint on the upper third had blistered and gone brown at the edges, and the vent slots near the top were choked with a hard, dark crust that no amount of scrubbing had lifted. The door was sealed. Not merely locked, but sealed, with a heavy brass padlock through the hasp and a second, older lock built into the door itself, and, over both of those, a bead of lead solder that someone had run along the seam between the door and the frame, so that the whole thing looked less like a piece of storage. At the end of his life, to make private forever, the man who had laughed was named Curtis Denham, and he owned 3 car lots between Beckett's Ford and the county line. He was 51 that fall, heavy through the shoulders and belly, clean-shaven and ruddy in the way of men who eat well and sit down for most of their working hours. He wore a mustard-colored sport coat over a polo shirt, with his own dealership's logo stitched above the heart, and a gold ring on his little finger caught the afternoon sun whenever he lifted his hand. His new Lincoln sat at the edge of the field, cream-colored and washed that morning, and it did not belong in a field of pickup trucks any more than Curtis Denham belonged in a crowd that had come to grieve. The man who had bought the locker was named Elias Ward. He was 69 that fall, lean and a little stooped, with a face that had been weathered by 50 winters of outdoor work, and eyes that had gone pale gray from squinting at fine metal. He wore a canvas jacket, the color of old wheat, over a chambray shirt washed so many times the collar was nearly white, and a work cap that had once been navy blue and was now a shape more than a color. He was a locksmith. He had been a locksmith since he was 17 years old, when he had walked into Halden Rowe's shop on Cutter Street and asked to sweep the floor. His hands, when he raised his paddle to bid, were scarred across every knuckle and across the meat below the thumb where a pick had slipped in 1962 and left a white curve of a mark that never went away. Curtis Denham called out loud enough for the whole tent, $95 for a smoked-up coffin, Elias. What's the matter? Run out of houses to break into? And the crowd laughed, because that was the shape of the afternoon. He gave the locker a name right there, standing under the auction tent with a paper bidding number in his fist. He called it the Tin Coffin, and the name, stuck the way a coin name will stick when the man who coined it has enough voice to carry it. Elias Ward did not answer. He walked up to the platform, paid $95 in cash to the clerk, and asked 2 of the yard hands if they would help him wheel the locker to his truck. He did not look at Curtis Denham. He looked at the seam of lead solder along the door, and at the brass padlock, and at the older keyhole in the door itself, and something in his face went quiet, in the way that a man's face goes quiet when he has just recognized a piece of handwriting from a long time ago. because Elias Ward had recognized the lock. Not the padlock, which was ordinary, but the older lock built into the door, which was a carbon lever lock of a pattern that had gone out of production in 1948, and which had been the specialty of one particular man in that county. A man who had cut and installed such locks for the firehouses and the bank vaults and the courthouse evidence rooms until his hands got too shaky to hold the file. And that man had been Halden Rowe, who had taught Elias Ward the trade. There is a way of looking at a piece of work that only the person who was taught by its maker can look at it. Elias Ward looked at that lock the way a son looks at his father's handwriting on the back of a photograph. And he knew, without yet knowing why, that the locker on the auction platform had once belonged to a man his teacher had trusted, and that whatever was inside it had been sealed by someone who had wanted very badly for the right kind of person to be the one who opened it. Halden Rowe had told him, back in the winter of 1938, when Elias was 18 and had ruined his fourth pin in a row, that a lock is a promise. He had said it, standing at the bench with his hands folded behind his back, the way he did when he wanted a thing remembered. A lock is a promise, he had said, between the man who made it and the man who owns it, and if you pick it wrong, you break the promise, and the promise cannot be mended even if the lock can. That was the shape of Halden Rowe's teaching. He did not teach speed. He did not teach force. He taught listening, and he taught patience, and he taught the boy that steel had a memory the same as a man did, and that if you treated it kindly. Elias Ward had spent 52 years listening to locks. He had opened bank drawers whose owners had died without leaving the combinations, and he had opened a bride's grandmother's jewelry box on the morning of her wedding, and he had opened the ignition of a doctor's car in a snowstorm so the doctor could reach a woman in labor 8 miles away. He had never once charged more than the job was worth, and he had never once told a story about a lock he had opened, because Halden Rowe had also told him that a locksmith who talks is a locksmith who ends up alone in his shop with no work coming through the door. He drove the locker home slow that October afternoon in his 1971 Ford pickup, with the bed slats padded with old moving blankets so the steel would not scrape against itself. The road ran along the creek for 2 miles, and the maples were red, and the cottonwoods were yellow, and the whole valley had that end-of-year smell of leaf smoke and cold water and cut hay. He did not turn on the radio. He drove with both hands on the wheel, and he thought about the locker in the bed of the truck, and about the man whose name had been on the auction ledger, which was Captain Thomas Halloran, and about the fire in December of 1961, the life of Captain Thomas Halloran, who had walked out of that fire alive and had spent the next 25 years being blamed for it. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness, right up until the moment it doesn't. Elias Ward had lived his whole life inside that kind of patience, and he had watched other men mistake it for cowardice, or for slowness of mind, or for the natural dullness of a country tradesman who had never left the county he was born in. He had let them mistake it. Halden Rowe had told him, once, that the world was going to keep getting louder, and that the men who could still hear a small sound inside a big one were going to become fewer and fewer, and that when there were only a handful of them left, they would be very quietly the most important men in any room they walked into. Elias had not believed him at 18. He believed him now. He backed the truck up to the door of his workshop, which sat behind his house on a lot that had been in his family since the county was surveyed. And he and his young helper, a quiet boy of 19 named Peter Vance, who had been coming to the shop after his shift at the grain elevator for the last 2 years, wheeled the locker in on a hand truck and stood it upright on the concrete floor under the yellow light of the bench lamps. Peter Vance did not ask any question. He had learned, in his 2 years with Elias, that questions came at the end of a job, not the beginning, and that a man who was reading a lock did not want to be interrupted any more than a man who was reading a letter from his mother. By nightfall, the story of the $95 tin coffin had traveled the 6 miles into town and had settled into the booths at Merle's Diner the way gossip settles, thick and warm and unhurried. Men who had not been at the auction repeated Curtis Denham's joke and gave it new corners. Someone said Elias Ward had finally gone soft in the head. Someone else said he was going to try to sell the locker for scrap and lose money on the gas it took to haul it. A man named Roy Alden, who had known Elias since they were both boys, sat at the counter and stirred his coffee and said only that Elias had never bought a thing in his life he did not have a reason to buy, and that the town would find out the reason in due course, and that in the meantime everyone ought to eat their pie and mind their own business. Roy Alden was not a man given to defending anyone, and the counter went a little quieter after he said it, but not much, because a good joke in a small town has a longer life than a true opinion. The next morning, Elias Ward stood in front of the locker with a cup of black coffee in his hand, and did not touch it for 40 minutes. He looked at the lead solder along the seam. He looked at the Corbin lever lock. He looked at the scorch marks on the upper third of the door, and at the way the paint had bubbled but had not run, which told him the fire had been hot but brief, and that the locker had been near the edge of the burning, not at the heart of it. He set the coffee down. He picked up a small pick from the tray on the bench, and he began. He began with the padlock, because the padlock was the outer promise and the newer one, and because it would give first. It took him. He did not force it. He listened to it. He set the pick against the pins the way a man sets a finger against the throat of a bird to feel the pulse, and he waited, and he lifted, and he waited, and after 3 hours the shackles sprang open with a small metallic sigh, and he laid it on the bench. The Corbin lock took him 4 days. He worked on it at night, mostly, after Peter Vance had gone home, with the shop door closed, and the radio off, and only the sound of the wall clock, and the sound of his own breath, and the small, dry. On the second night he broke a pick and had to file a new one. On the third night he thought he had it, and then felt the tumbler slip back into place, and he sat down on the stool and closed his eyes for a full 10 minutes before he tried again. On the fourth night, a little past 11, the lock turned under his hand with a sound like a held breath finally letting go, and he sat back on the stool and put both his scarred hands flat on the bench and did not move for a long time. The lead solder along the seam he cut last, with a small heated iron and a scraper, working the bead loose in inches, careful not to gouge the paint on the frame. It took him another 2 hours, and when the last inch of solder lifted free, he set the iron down and stepped back from the locker and did not open it. He stood there and looked at it. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He turned off the bench lamp and went into the house and slept, because Halden Rowe had told him once that a man who opens a promise in a hurry has already broken it, and that if a locker had been sealed by a dying man, that dying man deserved the courtesy of a night's sleep between the last cut and the first look. In the morning, with the light coming pale through the shop windows and the coffee going cold on the bench, Elias Ward opened the door of the locker Inside there were three things. On the top shelf, a manila envelope, sealed with a wax stamp that had cracked and yellowed with age. On the middle shelf, a cloth bundle tied with butcher's twine, heavy enough that the shelf beneath it had bowed slightly over the years. On the bottom shelf, a single folded letter addressed in a careful block script that said, "To whoever opens this." He took the letter first. He sat down on the stool and he unfolded it, and he read it slowly, the way a man reads a thing he knows he will only read for the first time once. The letter was from Captain Thomas Halloran, dated the 4th of April, 1962, 4 months after the firehouse fire. It said that on the night of the 17th of December, 1961, Captain Halloran had been called to the firehouse at 9 in the evening by his second-in-command, a man named Doyle Reeves, who had told him there was a problem with the fuel line to the generator. It said that when Captain Halloran arrived, the fuel line was fine, and Doyle Reeves was in the office at the back of the building with the safe open and a cloth bag on the desk. It said that Doyle Reeves had been stealing from the Firemen's Benefit Fund for 11 months, taking small amounts that would not be missed, and that on that night he had been taking a larger amount because his wife had left him. It said that when Captain Halloran walked in, Doyle Reeves had knocked over the kerosene lamp on the desk, either by accident or on purpose, and that the fire had gone up the curtains within seconds. It said that Captain Halloran had tried to pull Doyle Reeves out and had failed, and had barely gotten out himself, and that 2 other firemen who had been sleeping in the bunk room had died before the trucks could reach the second floor. The letter said that the county investigator had found the safe open and the money missing, and had concluded that Captain Halloran had been the thief, because Doyle Reeves was dead and could no longer be blamed, and because Captain Halloran had been the only living man in the building when the fire started. It said that Captain Halloran had spent 4 months trying to prove otherwise, and had not been able to, because a ledger that showed Doyle Reeves's thefts had burned in the fire, and the bank in Beckett's Ford had refused to release records without a court order, and the court had refused to grant one, because the case was closed and a man was dead, and the town wanted to move on. The letter said that Captain Halloran had gone back to the ruins of the firehouse 2 weeks after the fire and had found, in the ashes of the office, the small steel cash box from the safe, buckled but not burned through, and that inside it had been the ledger, scorched at the edges but readable. It said he had also found, in the pocket of Doyle Reeves's coat, which had been thrown clear when the roof fell, an envelope containing $3,200 in cash, which was very close to the amount that had been reported missing from the benefit fund over the previous year. It said that Captain Halloran had taken these things home and had sealed them in his locker, along with a sworn and notarized statement of everything he knew, and that he had done this because he intended to bring them to the state investigator's office in Columbus. The letter said he had not made it to Columbus. He had suffered a stroke on the 11th of April, 1962, and had lost most of his speech, and had lived another 24 years in a small house on the edge of town, cared for by his daughter, unable to tell anyone where the locker was, because his wife had had the locker moved out of the firehouse before the fire spread to it and had put it in storage without knowing what was inside, and because Captain Halloran, after the stroke, could no longer say the word locker or the word key or any of the words that would have told her. The letter ended in a hand that had grown shakier by the last line, with a single sentence. It said, "Please give what is inside to my daughter Ruth, and please tell the town that I did not steal from my men." Elias Ward folded the letter. He set it down on the bench. He opened the manila envelope, and inside were the ledger, scorched at the edges, and the sworn statement, and a small brown notebook in Doyle Reeves' handwriting that listed, in a private and shameful accounting, every dollar he had taken and every date he had taken it on. He untied the cloth bundle, and inside were the $3,200 in cash, still banded in the paper wrappers the bank had issued in 1961, and a small brass key on a leather cord, which fit, Elias later confirmed. The safe deposit box that Captain Halloran had rented in his daughter's name at the Beckett's Ford Farmers Bank in the spring of 1962, and which had gone unopened for 25 years. He could have kept it. The cash alone was more money than he had made in any 2 years of his life. The safe deposit box, when it was later opened by Ruth Halloran in the presence of a bank officer, was found to contain 7 Morgan silver dollars in a velvet pouch and the deed to 40 acres of good bottom land east of the river, which Captain Halloran had bought quietly in 1958 and had never told anyone about. Elias Ward could have kept the cash and burned the letter and buried the ledger, and no one in the county would ever have known, because no one in the county knew what had been in the locker. And Captain Halloran was dead, and Doyle Reeves was dead. He drove into town the next morning. He drove to the small brick house on Sycamore Street where Ruth Halloran lived, a woman of 48 who had cared for her father until his death the previous spring, and who now worked at the county library and lived alone with a gray cat and a small garden of late tomatoes. He knocked on the door. When she opened it, he took off his cap, and he handed her the manila envelope and the cloth bundle and the letter, and he said, "Your father asked me to bring these to you." He waited while she read the letter, standing on a front porch with his cap in his hands, and when she began to cry, he did not step forward, and he did not step back. He only waited because that was what the moment asked of him. And when she looked up and tried to thank him, he shook his head, and he said he did the work. I only opened the door. And then he put his cap back on, and he walked to his truck, and he drove home. The ledger and the notebook and the sworn statement went, within 2 weeks, to the state investigator's office in Columbus, and then to the county prosecutor, and then on a cold Tuesday in November, to the front page of the Beckett's Ford Weekly Herald, which ran the headline, "Captain Halloran Cleared After 25 Years." Above a photograph of the man in his fire captain's dress uniform, taken in 1959. The county commission voted that December to place a bronze plaque on the wall of the new firehouse, and beneath the plaque, in a glass case, they placed the olive-painted locker itself, with the door standing open and the shelves empty, so that anyone who came in to pay a fire bill or to bring a school class through on a tour could see the thing that had held the truth for a quarter of a century. Curtis Denham said very little that winter. His car lots did not fail immediately, but they did fail over the course of the next 4 years, in the slow way that a business fails when the man who runs it has lost the town's willingness to laugh with him. He moved south in the spring of 1991 to a place near Fort Myers, and the county did not speak of him often after that. Elias Ward did not go to the ceremony when the plaque was hung. He went a week later, on a Thursday evening in December, after the firehouse had closed for the day. He stood on the sidewalk across the street in the cold, with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and his breath white in the streetlight, and he looked at the locker through the window for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he walked back to his truck, and he drove home, and he put a fresh pot of coffee on the stove, and he sat down at his workbench, where Peter Vance had left a small brass padlock and a note that said, "This one is giving me trouble. Would you look at it in the morning?" And Elias Ward smiled, for the first time in a long time, and he turned off the light and he went to bed. So I'll leave it with you. If a dying man's truth had fallen into your hands, along with the money that proved it, and no one in the world knew you had it, would you have carried it on a cold morning to the door of a woman who did not know your name, or would you have kept it and told yourself the dead do not need what the living can use?